to this, our new episode of the World Discord podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Joel Ostrow.
And I am your other host, Brian Endless. How you doing today, Joel?
I am doing well. How are you?
I am just fine. The weather's a little better in Chicago. Life is good.
I'm looking forward to this episode. It is on a topic that I know very little about, despite the fact that it's relatively close to home. Why don't you kick us off, Brian?
Sounds good. We are going to be talking about Cuba today, or as many Americans say, Cuba. I tend to pronounce it as Cuba, but you can do either way that you want to. We hear a lot about Cuba and know very little about it, or at least most of us know very little about it. Very close to the U.S., 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Most of us know that it was Castro's communist regime since 1959. Not everybody knows that he overthrew an American-backed dictator at that point in time in a civil war, and that's a lot of what goes into Cuba's history. Very importantly for the present, the U.S. put sanctions on Cuba in 1960. Started sanctions then and then really picked them up full in 1962. And those sanctions have been going almost nonstop, slight break during the Obama administration, but those sanctions have been almost nonstop since that point in time. This is, I would argue, a central thing in Cuba, in Cuban politics and Cuban life, and ask our guests to talk about it. We can go into some of the reasons behind what was happening with Castro. When the Soviet Union fell, Cuba had hard times with a big economic crisis since the Soviets were their supporter. And now we are finally past the Castro era. In 2008, Fidel Castro handed the reins over to his brother Raul. And in 2021, it was passed to the current leader. We can talk about that. Very briefly, I want to run through the laundry list of current problems that we're going to want to talk about as we go forward. Right now, the U.S. has a near total blockade on Cuba at a horrific time. Blackouts, fuel crises, as in they're out of oil, water shortages, sanitation, hyperinflation, public health crisis has all led to increased political repression and decreased tourism, and has left the island in a horrific state right now. So with that, I think I've set ourselves guessed up with about 20 different things we could talk about. And Joel, I will ask you to introduce her.
Sounds great. Thank you, Brian. We are very fortunate to be joined by Lauren Derby, an associate professor in the Department of History at UCLA. And she is the director of the Caribbean program in the International Institute. Professor Derby has written quite a bit about Haiti and the Dominican Republic, published a book that won numerous awards called The Dictator's Seduction, Politics and the Popular Imagination in the Era of Trujillo. Really interesting history of publications, including about food and animals, and encourage you to look through her stuff. But Lauren is also expert on Cuba, and I think Lauren, for a way to start off the conversation, this is my question is going to reveal how little I know about what's going on there. Obviously, during the Cold War, especially after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, U.S.-Cuban relations were fraught, to say the least. But I know that started to ease quite a bit. I feel like it began under the George W. Bush administration, but certainly during Obama's years, the relationship had thawed between the U.S. and Cuba quite a bit. Tourism became quite extensive. For a while, it was very easy to travel back and forth. And then things turned south. So could you maybe start there? Like, what caused the current turn? It might be an obvious answer towards the fraught relations, and then we can go from there.
Well, there's been a tightening of the sanctions under Trump. Trump's first time in office, and now he's actually been tightening the screws of the sanctions just recently. So there's actually some new news. We know that the Venezuela effort to remove Maduro. I think that emboldened the Trump administration to really try and they thought that Cuba was going to be another Venezuela. It's not. Because the Cubans have been fighting the United States not since 1959, but since since their independence, when Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders came in and stole independence from the Cubans after 30 years of fighting the Spanish. So, and at the terms of the U.S. drawn up independence for Cuba included the Platt Amendment, which enabled them to militarily intervene whenever U.S. interests were threatened, and of course, because there was a lot of investment in sugar and different kinds of food companies in the early 20th century throughout the Circum-Caribbean, they did many times. I mean, there was 4 years of military rule, and then there were, the whole Cuban Republican period was there were many military interventions, and basically, and of course, another issue for their independence was that they put the Guantanamo base in Cuba, which has been used to during the Bush administration. They started using this as a kind of extrajudicial space where our terrorist subjects could be kept, which is totally.
And I mean, what you're describing is all, hey, we've got an American sphere of influence, and we can do anything we want to anybody inside of that sphere of influence.
And another feature of the terms of independence for Cuba was that the reciprocity treaty. So basically, it locked Cuba into being a net food importer, and the U.S. and Cuba became, really important trading partners. So there's a lot, and that was very upsetting to Cubans that they lost their food sovereignty, and it's also, and it also locked Cuba in part. I mean, the long history of food sovereignty is a complicated one that also has to do with the Russian period, but it locked Cuba into sugar, which has made it's been a big challenge to Cuban food sovereignty. So the recent Trump tightening of sanctions, I mean, you could also I think there's plenty to fault the Biden administration, because Biden, for example, kept Cuba on the list of terrorist nations, which made, which was a big problem for Cuba in the world. But the tightening of sanctions under Trump, which are based on a lie, like, Trump has killed, I think, over 200 fishermen in the area around Venezuela on the lie that Venezuela is drug trafficking. That's not true. Actually, the major narco country in Latin America is the Dominican Republic and Haiti, who are working together. But Abinader is a Trump ally, and so he gets money to on the grounds that he's fighting drugs in the hemisphere. I mean, I think this whole question of drug trafficking is remarkably absurd, given the other day when we have a new Trump ally who was elected in Colombia, and the first thing he did was shut the Haitian embassy on the grounds that they were drug traffickers. Excuse me, they are drug traffickers, I'm afraid, but where are the drugs coming from? Colombia.
Right, yeah.
So that was like one of the more absurd moments in all of this performativity around, signaling that we're a Trump ally.
So Lauren, is Cuba, and I actually don't know the answer to this one, is Trump accusing Cuba of being part of the drug trafficking, or is there something else that's the public accusation?
No. It's just that this is part of the broader picture, how the U.S., on the grounds of drug trafficking in Venezuela, they kidnapped the current president of Venezuela. So it's kind of it's part of the bigger picture of how Trump is operating in the area. And I think the ease of snatching Maduro also made him really think that, we can do what we want in Cuba. But Cuba is a very different situation than Venezuela, partly because the Cubans have this long history of compromised sovereignty, which they see as going back to 1898. So, and then of course 1959, Cuba finally ousts the United States and tries to achieve its own sovereignty, and then you have the Bay of Pigs. There's a military effort to oust Fidel, which failed miserably because most people were behind. I mean, really, the Cuban Revolution was really, it was anti-corruption because the Batista was a remarkably corrupt regime. And that's where you see, I mean, most of the 20th century social movements in Latin America have been anti-corruption, because that's been a big problem in Latin American history in the 20th century. But, it didn't stop, the Bay of Pigs didn't stop there, because for over 60 years, the U.S. tried to kill Fidel Castro. And there's a really good documentary about this, which this may seem a little self-serving because I'm a talking head in it, but it's really good, Mafia Spies, because it shows how it's not just that the U.S. tried to kill Fidel Castro, but they also tried to employ the mafia to do so. Of course, the mafia had owned basically all of the nightlife, the gambling casinos and so forth in Batista's regime. And so they were happy to try and take, the Havana back from Fidel. But it's pretty scandalous to realize that Kennedy would go against his brother, who was policing the mafia, in order to kill Fidel Castro. So I highly recommend that documentary. It's very well done.
May I ask, what? It's a stupid question, but what was the source of Trump's turning the situation of U.S. relations with Cuba to more contentious in his first term and now? Like, what do they want? Was there anything behind it? And what has been Cuba's reaction, the Cuban government? Like, what is the main challenge they face in trying to resist?
Well, so actually, the Trump administration, I mean, I think that Marco Rubio is driving the, Marco Rubio, who represents the kind of old Cuban lobby based in Miami. He's never, I don't think he's ever set foot in Cuba, so he doesn't know anything about Cuba today. Cuba's not the country it was in 1959. The Cubans refused to negotiate with Marco Rubio because they hate him, so he's not part of the negotiations. I think there probably are negotiations happening when one gets these, little rumors of talks that are probably happening through the Vatican, and the Vatican, because we have a very progressive Pope now, and the Cubans trust the Vatican. So if there are negotiations, it's probably happening through them. But about a month ago, the Trump administration released a 100-page document on Cuba, which is a really chilling document. It basically, it's a very Cold War kind of document, because it tries to portray Cuba as basically the reason why we have a left wing, a left wing in the United States. It puts Cuba behind it. I mean, it's a really shocking document that is completely counterfactual, but it makes the Cuban threat much, much bigger than it would be, because, and of course, how they define the left is the Democrats are also part of the radical
Did this
left.
come out recently, this document? Because I also read a news article, it was like a week or two ago, and it was kind of like buried, that suggested the Trump administration was trying to identify Cuba's next leader, which is so offensive on so many levels. But was that part of that document?
Well, I think it's part of their negotiations. So they've done a couple of things. They've tightened the sanctions. They've been curtailing. There are a number of countries in Latin America that have been, selling oil to Cuba, and they've been curtailing those shipments. And just recently, in the past few days, they're now trying to take on the food access, because Cuba, surprisingly, given the embargo, which has been in place since the revolution, surprisingly, Cuba imports a lot of especially its meat supply. So meat has been a problem for the Cuban Revolution, in part because of the nature of the swapping economy that they set up with the Soviets, and partly because Cubans mostly did not eat a whole lot of meat, and they were so excited that they could have access to meat in the libreta system, the rationing system, that they ate their herd. And so for a long time, the Soviet swapping economy was based on, they swapped canned meat for sugar. So meat has been a problem for a long time, and Cuba imports about 80% of its frozen chicken parts from the United States. And now the U.S. government is going after. They're trying to clamp down. I mean, it's kind of ironic, the whole food question. For a number, I find this a little counterintuitive for a number of reasons. On the one hand, I know that I used to live in Chicago. I went to the University of Chicago for my PhD, and I remember back in the day when I was there in the 90s, there was a huge amount of lobbying on the part of the Midwestern states who want to sell grain to Cuba. Like they want
absolutely
the embargo lifted. And I don't quite know where the poultry is coming from, but poultry, is a big, it's a very important resource for Cuba. But recently, I read that that Marco Rubio has been, we have the embargo in place. We have the tightening of the embargo. There are U.S. interests who are invested in selling meat to Cuba. But recently, the U.S. government did something which I found particularly nefarious because during, one of the most important benefits of the Cuban Revolution was the rationing system. So Cubans really didn't have, especially, the Afro-descended population, the descendants who were poor and descendants of slaves and so forth, they did not have access to meat on a daily basis. So the rationing system, the libreta, enabled, the Cuban government, this is one of the major benefits of the revolution, is that the Cuban government gave Cubans access to sugar, rice, beans, and coffee. And I think for a time, meat was a part of the rationing system. And so Marco Rubio has been now taken, basically they gave about a few $1 million of food rations to Cubans, and they gave the same products that were on the rationing system, which to me is like, okay, they want to look like they are the patronage model of, and that was really one of the more popular benefits that the Cuban Revolution provided, was having access to these basic staples. And I find it a little perverse that the U.S. government is now they're doing this through the Catholic Church, but they're providing exactly what used to be in the rationing system, which the Cuban government can no longer provide because of the U.S. embargo. So I found that a little bit perverse, actually.
I want to clarify that, and I agree. I want to clarify for a minute because most Americans have no clue what happened in Cuba. We have been taught, as most of us grow up, that Cuba bad, that the kicked out all these people. They're now in Miami, took all their property. Fidel Castro nationalized everything in the country after he came into office. And we're taught that the Cuban government is horrible. That is absolutely true for people who are middle-class business people or upper-class people who had to flee at the time of the revolution. But the vast majority of the population were incredibly poor. They were kept incredibly poor by the Batista regime, and Castro's administration really did excellent things for them. There's most of the developing world, especially in Latin America, looks to Cuba as a model because of the food rationing, rationing bad, getting food good when you wouldn't have had food beforehand. And then the other things are they're known for having a fantastic education system for a very poor country and an incredible healthcare system for a very poor country. And we don't hear any of that in the United States because Rubio and others have the ear of the public. Marco Rubio's family goes back to those rich families, and we only hear the one side of it. So that's not to say kicking people out of the country is good, but there were a lot of positives for the Cuban people who remained.
Yeah, I think your point is spot on, that most Americans don't know what life was like for poor Cubans. And I think one way to think about that is not comparing, as Cubans often do, because the country was so Americanized, they often compare themselves to the United States. But let's talk about the models in the region for countries which were, which suffered, U.S. military intervention and had a lot of investment, which made them into monocultural economies based on sugar. And that would be Puerto Rico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. And the Dominican Republic has, I think for men, it's an average 3rd grade education, and for poor Dominicans, and an average 5th grade education for women. So that is, Cuba is remarkable what it achieved in the world of healthcare. I mean, they developed a vaccine for lung cancer, which they can't export to the United States. I have two relatives who died of lung cancer this past year. I mean, maybe they would have liked to have access to that vaccine. That's remarkable.
Yeah,
it really is remarkable. And I mean, there's a lot more you can say about what Cuba did in the world of the arts, which is remarkable. I mean, here in California, I have a friend who's a contemporary music composer who did a degree at UCLA, and his troupe in Pasadena, they're all straight from Havana. They're all Soviet trained. They're incredible musicians. We don't have that kind of training in the arts, or film, or dance in the rest of Latin America, really. Except perhaps you could talk about Mexico or Argentina or Brazil, which are major powerhouses. But really, you need to think about Cuba in relation to Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico almost went bankrupt about 10 years ago. The Dominican Republic and Haiti, of course, Haiti's controlled by gangs, and the Dominican Republic has become the major drug trafficking route to Europe and the United States. Like, these are the potential models, and I think if Trump wants to see some kind of regime change, I hate to say it, but I think probably that Cuba, given its proximity to the Dominican Republic, would become, would want fast cash, and it would only expand the major drug trafficking that's happening from Latin America. I will say, but getting back to the question of nationalizations, it's also a little ironic. When the nationalizations happened in 1959 and 60, the Cuban government offered to pay for all of the money that was lost by these companies, and the U.S. companies refused to be reimbursed.
Right.
Yeah.
France did.
It wasn't really
Canada
a communist revolution, right? Like, Castro initially wanted better relations with the U.S. And part of the rapprochement that happened, certainly, I can't remember if it began under Obama or before, but it certainly accelerated during Obama's 8 years. And part of the argument was, and it was a fact, that it was beneficial to our economy as well. There were American interests that really benefited. We just did a long series on the corruption and money grubbing of the Trump regime. And it seems like continuing down that path would have kept open even more avenues for them to line their pockets. What are they gaining by closing off and being hostile to Cuba? Like, what do you have an idea of what the hope out of that is? And then my follow-up question was, like, what is that causing internally in terms of the political stability in Cuba? Because obviously the economic situation there has turned for the worse. So it's kind of two sides of that same coin.
Well, I have I read something that flashed across my Instagram feed from El País, which indicated that Trump is interested in buying, in purchasing for his own tourist development, an island off the coast of Cuba. So that's one feature to this.
Wait for one moment. Wait for one moment. I have to be surprised. Okay, this is my surprised face. Good, please go ahead.
No.
I mean, that, but it is bizarre. I mean,
the surprise is that he wants to buy it. It looks like he's going to try to take it.
Well, he's used that rhetoric of taking Cuba. But the thing is that it's really, the tightening of sanctions is just creating a humanitarian catastrophe. People are dying without access to medicines, and so forth. But it's really remarkable. So I'm one of the co-directors of something called the UC Cuba Academic Initiative, and we have a lot of students who are going back and forth to Cuba. And we have one remarkable student who's doing this fascinating study of something which to me was a remarkable instance of the way Cubans separate the contemporary economy and the political system. And so the Cuban government developed something called the Family Code in 1975, which was trying to incorporate women into the workforce by basically forcing men to do half of the housework, and also to develop daycare, creches, and also cafeterias at school, because it worked, because in those days, and continuing into the 19, and continuing in Caribbean nations often had the biggest meal at lunch, which meant that there was a huge burden for women who had to go home and cook and prepare lunch, and then you'd have a siesta after that. It was kind of the Spanish model. But they're redoing the family code today. And we have a student who's doing her dissertation on this. This, to me, was remarkable, because the one of the biggest issues in Cuba today are trans rights, and the evangelicals are pouring money because they don't want trans rights to be written into the family code, which is the big issue for Cubans today. One of the Castro family members is a big trans right activist, and this has become a big issue for Cubans on the ground. And so they're rewriting the family code. And what she's documented in her research is that people are having focus groups, and they're meeting 20, 30 times to go over the language, because they're so upset that the evangelicals are pouring millions of dollars to keep trans rights out. So, Cuba sees the U.S. as hindering their sovereignty from 1898 until today. And I think this is a remarkable story that that I didn't know about, and I wouldn't have known about except for the students' research. But of course, it makes total sense. Evangelicals are a very important lobbying group in the United States today. Right. They've been emboldened under Trump. This started, I guess, with Reagan and Bush, the Bush years. Yep. The evangelicals have become so but I don't even know. There is a clause in the embargo that enables you to send money for religious purposes, which is how Marco Rubio has been able to bring Catholic, through the Catholic Church, he's been able to bring in money for food supplies. Although, really, the big problem is that there's an embargo, and that's the real reason why Cubans are not eating properly, and also the fuel supply issue has meant that, I have one woman I send groceries to on a revolving basis in Cuba, and I can't send her food anymore because I have no access. They have blackouts of 20, 30 hours, which is terrible.
Are these sanctions translating to internal political instability? No. Or because that's the purpose of them, right? To undermine the government?
But it's really remarkable, I think, how Cubans don't really, I haven't heard grumbling. I hear, look, Cubans self-censor. I've been going to Cuba since the 90s, and I will say Cubans self-censor. So sometimes it's hard to engage them in political conversations the way you would, shall we say, a Dominican or Haitian or Puerto Rican who's grumbling about their political elite. But it is remarkable how Cubans separate the contemporary crisis, which they really blame on the United States, with the issue of sovereignty, but or with the issue of, I should say, political governance. But it's kind of a trend. Like, this is something I observed in a number of different contexts. I've observed this in the Dominican Republic, that since we've had 15 years of remarkable corruption and terrible governance in the Dominican Republic, people have stopped thinking about the executive. They invest in these kind of sub rosa for aspects of politics. So I've noticed that there's been a wave of female governors, for example. People are trying to flip governors. And I also noticed this I have a student who wrote for a Fulbright application to study in Nicaragua. Nicaragua is one of the most horrible, forms of, terrible governance in Latin America. Daniel Ortega has said that he wants to cancel elections. And yet, in these tiny towns, she's documenting how the Sudanese healthcare, the system of clinics for women continue. And I think what we often, myself included, because my book is really about the executive branch, but we often get so obsessed with the executive branch that we don't think about these sub rosa forms of governance, which for people in Latin America are often more important, because just that I think, they have given up on. I mean, this is a Cuban phenomenon, but I think it's also in Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic. I think people have kind of given up on the executive branch because you've had so much corruption and malfeasance, and people are investing in these smaller community levels of governance that.
It's interesting in Cuba that you mentioned that, because that was Cuba's success story. Even beforehand, Castro and Che Guevara would leave books and medicine in every town that they went through. And then the Cuban model is small education, small clinics for everybody, and make sure every rural area has access to those things, even if it's just on a smaller version. They didn't leave people out, and that was a huge part of the success. So it's interesting that that's kind of turning in a different direction now.
You can see that a lot. There's a film that I often teach with by Saul Landau called Fidel. It's not a great. I mean, I often show the first 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and it shows Fidel and Che going into these remote rural communities. And this is the big problem of Cuba, is that Havana got all the resources and the rest of Cuba had nothing. And that was one of the key, ways in which the revolution really appealed to Cubans by giving them, as you say, rural health care. And if you see this film, you see Fidel going into these towns, and what are people asking for? They're like, our transit to the hospital is broken down. It's so everyday and so concrete, and that's what or like, we need parteras. We need, our partera has left. A partera is a person who helps with birth, and it's just like this was what endeared people to the Cuban Revolution, was solving these very basic dilemmas of everyday life that were completely a product of the fact that Havana got all the resources and the rest of the country got nothing. And I think, that's a really great point. And that's part of the reason why the Bay of Pigs was such a colossal failure. I mean, it's amazing that, this little ragtag country, including Che Guevara, was able to, defeat the United States. And it had to do with the fact that they just misunderstood the popularity of the Cuban Revolution, and I think your point, Brian, that it was really these kind of concrete, everyday improvements that endeared people to the regime, and I think this misunderstanding of Cuba continues till today. I mean, it's also been, I think the Maduro kidnapping has made Trump think that this would go very smoothly. And he doesn't realize.
It probably made the U.S. less popular even than it already was, right? That's the other side. Like, the United States over and over and over again overestimates our own popularity, overestimates the lack of popularity of the local regime, but really the resentment towards the United States. We're seeing this in Iran today.
Absolutely. I mean, Iran and Cuba, I think, are much more effective parallel than Venezuela and Cuba. I mean, Venezuela, the Maduro regime, not to go off on a track here, but it is part of, I think, their grand vision of Latin America now. I mean, the Maduro issue is kind of interesting. My friend who works in Guyana actually argued that the timing of the Maduro kidnapping had to do with the fact that Venezuela was about to go on the yuan, the Chinese currency, which makes sense because, we've had really no Latin American policy. And, the Chinese have taken over everywhere. I mean, they created a big port in which, Trump was crowing about the Panama Canal. Panama Canal is complete because of climate change. Can't do those huge barges on it anymore because it's too shallow. But the Chinese built an enormous port, and they built one in Central America, which is completely made the Panama Canal irrelevant, notwithstanding Trump's crowing. And they also created a huge heavy port in Cuba, and they've also now been providing a lot of solar power to Cuba. So Latin America is in a very different place than it was before because of all this Chinese investment. So that's also, an interesting. There's a sort of a I think that the Trump regime is out of date. What's happening in Latin America, this is not just Trump, because Biden really didn't do much besides immigration. That was the only issue for so they and the decline of soft power, humanitarian aid. It's all meant that basically Latin America has looked elsewhere in
and
ways.
Trump has completely emasculated any soft power that we ever had. Can you? I never really found out what this. Did anyone find out what the story was behind that? Whatever happened to the diplomats, the headaches, whatever, the sound waves, whatever. What was that incident all about? Was that ever solved?
That's a good question. I've kind of read a theory. I read a few theories about it, but they didn't. None of them rang true to me. They all sounded a little bit like conspiracy theories. I heard that there were Soviet listening devices which might have caused that, but I think that may be a conspiracy theory. So I'm not sure they got to the bottom of it. So often I've read an article about that, but none of the plausible reasons made sense to me. So,
and something supposedly happened in Beijing too, if I remember right. Was it in China? Do you remember, Brian? It wasn't just in Cuba where this happened. Something clearly happened and nobody knows what it was. It's strange.
I don't remember the Beijing side. I remember the Cuba side.
Yeah, this issue has played a role, I think, in the recent negotiations with Cuba, because one of the, I think it's a conspiracy theory, but one of the explanations for Marco Rubio and the Trump regime as seeing Cuba as this problem is because of Chinese and Soviet listening devices. But I have no evidence that they could actually, listen in on the United States. I think this is I think this is not truthful.
That seems a little too far.
Yeah, I think this is part of the this 100-page document where they're trying to make Cuba out to be a much bigger problem than it was. Cuba, look, in the 1980s, Cuba had a very militant foreign policy, and was, they were involved in supporting liberation movements in Central America and independence movements in Africa. But those days are long gone. And today Cuba has a very dysfunctional economy, which is basically the Cuban medical aid has become the major foreign policy, foreign currency, source for Cuba. And now
by the way, just to clarify that, medical aid is because they've got no charge to the student medical programs, doctor programs, and they put out so many doctors that they end up shipping them to other countries.
Right. And I will say, since I work in Haiti, I was in the Haitian earthquake in 2010. It shut down the airport, and so I was in the Dominican Republic about a week after the earthquake. And I can tell you that, and after that, because I work on Haiti, I talked to a lot of UCLA doctors who UCLA, my university, deployed a large battalion of doctors who were completely ineffective. They were completely ineffective, unlike the Cuban medical professionals who, because of their years in Angola and so forth, they knew how to operate without electricity. They were, from the get-go, they were very effective. I also heard very disturbing conversations that I was privy to after the fact with UCLA doctors, because UCLA doctors and I guess other doctors as well were doing about 100 amputations a day. And I remember because they had complex fracture wounds from the earthquake. And, I remember being at some of the UCLA doctors events and them saying, maybe we should have rethought our protocols, because of course in Haiti, you can't get prosthetic limbs, you can't get wheelchairs, and the roads are terrible. Right. I've met so many Haitians who can't leave their house because they lost their legs in the earthquake. So that's very chilling. But I think, the Cuban doctors were much more better prepared to, and they had different protocols because they knew what Angola looks like and Mozambique and so forth. And they've been working in Africa for a very, very long time.
That's an issue with Western doctors everywhere we go. I study Africa primarily, but Western doctors go in, and one of the reasons Doctors Without Borders is so valuable is they do have the experience you're talking about. But Western doctors go in and they have Western mindsets, and amputation is a great example. Here, amputation is something you live and go on with your life with, and it's terrible. But we have ways to let you live a life where in most of the world that's simply not the case. I want to switch back for 1 second because you mentioned something that I'm fascinated by, and I just literally heard about it a few days ago. Someone has been suggesting that with Chinese solar power coming in, the Cubans may end up surviving this by replacing oil with renewable energy sources. I don't know how much you know about that or how much you've heard about that.
And is China able to break the embargo? Are they able to get materials through?
Well, I hear that there are a lot of Chinese solar panels in Cuba today. I mean, it's been a while since I'm supposed to go back in February so I can report back to what I see. But for example, my friend who I was buying food for, she asked me for a solar powered fan, which I purchased for her. Which somehow, I don't know how I can do this, but somehow, notwithstanding the embargo, I'm able to buy groceries for her and also a solar fan and so forth. But I hear that the whole, the whole oil question is quite, has changed a lot given all of the solar panels. But I think that maybe more like in the major cities, you have access to solar power. And I have a friend who works in the Sierra Maestra. She works, she has a book coming out on the agrarian form. And, I think, her stories from her recent trip, she was there a couple months ago, and she said the inequalities of the countryside versus the major cities is really acute. This is also, thinking about the food question, because it's now targeting access to food. And it's too bad because during what we call the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba went to an almost all organic food model, which was fantastic. And there's a wonderful film which I show in class about this. But since then, they've reverted to a more industrial agricultural model, which is why today Cuban farming requires fertilizers which are based on oil products and so forth. And so that's part of the reason why. I think this happened probably during the heyday of the Venezuelan oil boom, when Chavez was giving a lot of money to poor countries in Latin America, and benefiting Cuba a lot. And that's why they probably reverted to this oil-based model. But it's too bad because the organic sector. I think organics are still pretty big in Cuba, bigger than they are in the United States because they don't, because they have to. But it's not quite the same way it was in the 90s, unfortunately.
Let me ask you, given the increase in hostility then and the effects that this U.S. embargo is having, much of the rest of the world is skeptical at a minimum of the direction our country's going, of our politics, whether it's in terms of trade and Trump's tariffs or the cutting of foreign aid. Does that strengthen Cuba's ability to forge its own ties, whether with Mexico or South American countries, which were already stronger than they were with us? But is Cuba likely to get more sympathy and more support in sort of standing up to the aggression of the United States, or is the problem just the geographical location really make things untenable for them?
Well, I think fortunately the wave of authoritarian regime is also we're seeing it in America. So the new president of Colombia, for example, was is a Trumpite, and the first thing he did was close the Cuban embassy and also the Haitian embassy, and so unfortunately, the heyday when Cuba had and when Latin America had more. Could diversify their alliances from the United States. The heyday of that period was, I would say, it was after the debt crisis. There was an interesting moment during the debt crisis when, the Dominican Republic and Argentina and a bunch of Brazil got together and they were like, we can't pay this debt. We can't afford it. So we're not going to pay it. And they had a debt, a concerted, like, they refused to pay the debt. That was extraordinary. That was a moment, I think, in the early, I want to say latter 70s and early 80s. And then, of course, during the regime of Hugo Chavez, which is not the Maduro regime. So everybody knows Maduro was corrupt and terrible. But Chavez did a lot of things, which I teach in my class, about which enabled American countries to diversify their trade alliances. He created something called ALBA, which was which deepened trade alliances between Argentina and Brazil and other countries, which was really good for poor countries like Bolivia. He gave subsidized oil to Haiti and Bolivia. Like, that was a moment when Latin America had the ability to diversify. But right now, it's not. I don't think it's happening, and I don't think it really can happen, given this new wave of authoritarianism. I mean, unfortunately, Trump. We had a very interesting visit by a Haitian journalist who revealed to me something that I thought was really chilling. He said the Trump effect in Haiti, that there was a member of the presidential cabinet who basically refused to resign because he said Trump didn't resign, so I'm not going to resign. So we have a Trump effect in Latin America, where this kind of ill-informed behavior and mendaciousness, lying, is, it's spreading.
At least Bolsonaro went to jail, though, right?
Yes,
like, he's behind bars.
That was great. Brazil is a model for us.
Brazil doesn't hear that all the time, so that's interesting. Brian, you want to ask the last question here?
Sure. So, Lauren, we often do a little bit silly, a little bit ideal sometimes question for our final one. In this case, if you had a magic wand and you could wave it and you could do just one thing that would significantly improve the situation
and getting rid of Trump is not it.
Right. Getting rid of Trump. What would it be? What would your one thing be?
Lift the embargo. I mean, everyone all the other countries of the world at the UN have been saying that the embargo, this is a humanitarian catastrophe. It's not going to bring about regime change. Sanctions have never brought about regime change. This is, they tried this on South Africa, they tried on Zimbabwe. It doesn't work. So, I mean, U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba, I think, is very incoherent right now. But I would say, solve the humanitarian problem. And you know what? If they don't, and they continue the embargo and tightening it, they're going to have an immigration crisis, even worse than they have. And now the Cubans have no longer their special, immigration status, and they're going to be pouring into Miami and New York and increasingly California.
People galore coming through.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's going to happen if they keep this embargo going. So
you're saying there might be consequences to our actions?
Imagine that. Yeah. Lauren Derby, thank you so much for joining us. I learned a lot about a country I should know a lot more about. But my information about Cuba is really more stuck in the Cold War era. And so I really appreciate you joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you, David, for producing. And we will see you next time on the World Discord podcast. Bye, everybody.
Bye.